Let's start at the very, very beginning. And that is from the first day of creation. Believe it or not, you go back to Genesis, you go back to Bereshis, the very second pasuk. According to our Chazal, there is a reference or a remez, a hint to Chanukah. V'choshech al pnei sahom, the very second pasuk of the Torah. V'choshech al pnei sahom, there was darkness on the face of the deep. Zu malchus yavam. This refers to the kingdom of the Syrian Greeks, shehechishu einayim shel Yisrael b'gzeiroseim, who darkened the eyes of the Jewish people with their decrees. So, the second pasuk of the Torah, our sages found an allusion, the period of the Avanim and the Chashmonaim, the Chanukah story. How so? Because he uses the word choshech. There was choshech on the face of the deep. What's choshech? Oh, they darkened the eyes of the Jewish people. And indeed, in rabbinic literature, the period of the Avanim of the Greeks is typified by choshech, is typified by darkness. So the sages go on and they say, how so? Where does this darkness come from? Well, it says, they darkened the eyes of the Jewish people with their gezeros, with their decrees. And we would imagine, what decrees? Well, we know they forbade Shabbos under the pain of death. They forbade Yom Tov. They forbade circumcision, bris milah, some very serious decrees. And yet, the example of the decree that's given over there in that passage of the Talmud is that they darken the eyes of the Jewish people by doing what? By having them write on the horns of an ox. Ein lochem chelek be'elokei Yisrael. What were they trying to do? They made them write on the horn of an ox, you no longer have a portion in the God of Israel. So Rashi, on that medrash, explains that they were making reference to the Egel Hazov, to the golden calf. The Greeks, during the time of Chanukah, the period of the Chanukah story, were referencing the sin of the golden calf and saying that the Jewish people, from the time that they sinned at the golden calf, they had practiced themselves, worshiped themselves out of being the Jewish people. No longer have a portion in the God of Israel. So here we can ask two questions, two very fundamental questions. Why Chanukah at the time of Bereshis? Why is there a mention of Chanukah in the very first day of creation? It happened thousands of years later. What's the point that the Torah is trying to make? And the second question is, why, when it gives an example of the darkness of the decrees of the Jewish people, does it say that they would make Jews write on the horn of an ox, you no longer have a portion in the God of Israel? Why didn't they say, you know what the darkness is? No Shabbos. No Shabbos is darkness. No bris milah, no circumcision, that's darkness. But writing on the horn, hey, get your fountain pen out and write on the horn of an ox. You no longer have, yes, it's painful. They were reminding us of the sin of the golden calf, one of the greatest sins in our history. But come on, how does that compare with the outlawing of bris milah? How does it compare? So let's move a little forward to the Chanukah story itself. Tomorrow night, God willing, we're going to take part in that glorious mitzvah of lighting the Chanukah menorah. I mean, it's when we think of it, we get warm and fuzzy feelings, and we should. It's a beautiful mitzvah. Well, you say, any school child knows that. There was oil that they found, and instead of burning for 1 day, it burned for 8 days. It was a big miracle. Well, That can't be the celebration. I'm very sorry. I don't mean to impugn the knowledge of our early teachers, but that can't be the celebration. Why? Because you're talking about in the Holy Temple. And in the Holy Temple, miracles would abound. There are miracles all over the place. There were always miracles. As a matter of fact, there's a Mishnah in Avos 5:7, chapter 5, Mishnah 7, that says there were 10 miracles that took place regularly in the temple. So I'm sorry, but what's the big deal about this miracle? No big deal. A miracle. It was a place that was, miracles happened all the time. Some miracle happened, oil that could have burned for one day, burned for 7 days, for 8 days. Okay, come on. If we would be celebrating miracles on Chanukah, we should celebrate every day of the year, because every day of the year there were miracles in the temple. I mean, listen, I'm all for celebrating every day of the year, right? But where does that leave Chanukah, right? And it gets even more serious than this, because not only did other miracles take place, this very same miracle took place in the Beis Hamikdash. I mean, the very same miracle. The Talmud tells us that for 400 years, during the entire history of the first temple, and even into the second temple era, the Ner Ma'aravi, the western lamp, which was in the candelabra in the Beis Hamikdash, the western lamp, that didn't burn out. So every night they would burn the 7 lamps of the candelabra, every single night. In the morning, they would all be burnt out, except for the Ner Ma'aravi. By the way, we commemorate that in our shuls with the eternal light that's in front of the Aron. We commemorate the Ner Ma'aravi, this western light, which is on the candelabra in the temple. So oil, which could burn for 12 hours, because all the lamps burn for 12 hours to the next morning. So
attention, good afternoon, Shalom Torah, students. The Staten Island bus.
1 second, please.
Be dismissed early. The Staten Island bus and the Staten Island bus only is going to be dismissed early. The expected dismissal time for the Staten Island bus is in approximately 5 minutes, 3:20. The Staten Island bus and the Staten Island bus only has an approximated dismissal time of 3:20.
I'm sorry, I'm coming to you from a school, so that was the announcement. So every night they would light it, every evening they would light it, and the 7 lamps would burn for 12 hours, or 6 lamps would burn for 12 hours, and the 7th lamp would burn all day, and it was the exact same amount of oil, and the same lamp, the same one, for over 400 years, burnt miraculously for 12 hours. So my friends, supernatural is supernatural. If something can burn for 12 hours and it burns for 24 hours, that's supernatural. And it's no less of a miracle than a lamp burning that could burn for 1 day, that burns for 8 days. So what's the difference? Why are we celebrating Hanukkah? Oh, they found oil that could burn for 1 day and it burned for 8 days. So I say, that's really very nice. And it's a beautiful miracle. Miracles always happen in the Beis Hamikdash, number 1. Number 2 is this very miracle also happened. So why are we celebrating? We have to find a deeper understanding of this celebration. It's not just a miracle. It's not just celebrating miracles. 5th question. We celebrate the miracle, but we always have to ask ourselves, how did we get into the mess? Why did God, so to speak, allow the Greeks, the Syrian Greeks, to overwhelm us and to levy such terrible decrees against us? and to influence us in such a major way where much of our Jewish people were Hellenized. Well, why did God let this happen? You say, what kind of a silly question is that? It's not a silly question. The Gemara asks it, the sages ask it, they ask it about the slavery in Egypt. Why did that happen to us? Why did God bring that on us? They ask that question. They ask it about Purim. There's a Gemara in Megillah. The Gemara asks, why did God give Achashverosh and Haman the latitude, the ability to decree a death sentence against the Jews? The Gemara asks that question. It's interesting. The Gemara never asks it in terms of Chanukah. But we need to ask that question. Why did it happen? Nothing just happens in this world, and nothing just happens to the Jewish people. There are reasons. So why did it happen? So the first authority, the earliest authority that takes up that question is a commentary on the Tur Shulchan Aruch. We call him the Bach, from the name of his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, on the original code of Jewish law written by Rabbi Yaakov, the son of Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh. And this great commentary, the Bach, Bayis Chodosh, it's called Bach, is an acronym of his name, Bayis Chodosh. He was a 17th century scholar whose name was Rabbi Yoel Sirkus. And he was one of the great halachas of all time. And sometimes the Bach, Rabbi Yoel Sirkus, sometimes he waxes eloquent. And he gives us a deeper understanding of the halacha, or a deeper understanding of history. And here he asks the question. And he says that when it comes to Purim, the Gemara asks the question. When it comes to Chanukah, he says, I'll tell you the answer. And it's a shocking answer. It's a shocking answer because it needs to be explained. He says, you know why it happened? Because the Kohanim, the priests in the Beis HaMikdash, they were nisrashlu ba'avoda. They were weak in their service in the temple. They were lax in their service in the temple. That's what he says. And you say, what? I thought the answer would be something like they were involved in idol worship. I thought the answer would be maybe they violated Shabbos. Maybe they stopped bris milah. So therefore the Greeks came and said, you can't have bris milah. I thought it would be something like really serious. You mean to say they did the service in the temple? It doesn't even say they stopped the service in the temple. It says they were nisrashlu. They were nisrashel. They were chilled. They were lax in it. They didn't do it very well, but they still did it. That's the indictment of the Jews, which caused the Yevonim to overcome them and have such an influence on them and levy such harsh decrees against them. They were nisrashu ba'avoda. So my friends, we have to understand that. What does that mean? So to answer these 5 questions, a quick review. Why is Chanukah talked about the first day of creation? Second of all, that Medrash which talks about Chanukah on the first day of creation, having to do with the first day of creation, says that the terrible, harsh decree that those Yevonim did is they darkened the eyes of the Jewish people by saying you have to write on the horn of an ox, you don't have a portion in the God of Israel. Why is that so terrible? The third question, why are we celebrating a miracle? Miracles happen in the temple all the time. The fourth question, this very miracle happened in the Beis HaMikdash all the time. This very miracle for 400 years, over 400 years happened. And the fifth question, what was the crime that got them into this mess? Could it possibly have been that they were nisrashel ba'avoda, that they were weak in their service? Could that be it? So, I first got an inkling into the ability to answer these questions. My brother, he should live and be well. He told me a story of something that happened to him. And it's one of my favorite stories because it says so much about our condition. So I've said it over many times. If you've heard it already, please excuse me, but I think it's worthwhile. My brother at that time lived in the holy city of Hebron in Eretz Israel. It was 1987. It was the beginning of the first Arab uprising, otherwise known as the Intifada. It was a chilling time. I'm beginning to talk. It was very scary times. I'm sure you remember. Well, he was in the thick of things. He was living on call it an outpost outside of Hebron. Actually, in last week's Parsha, the Torah makes reference to Hebron, and Rashi there says, it says Be'emek. It says the Torah calls it Be'emek, in a valley, and Rashi says, oh, 1 minute. Isn't Hebron Bahar? Isn't Hebron on a mountain? And indeed, if you go to Hebron today, there's a valley, right? But where he lived was that mountain of which Rashi speaks. Isn't Rashi? It's on one side is a cold place called Tel Rameda or Admos Yishai. That's where Yishai, the father of David HaMelech, is buried. That's where Rus is buried. The great Rus is buried right there. So he lived in an area there with 7 other caravans, 7 other trailers, along with, at that time, probably about 50,000 Arabs that are in the valley. Well, it was one rainy night, 3 months into the Intifada, and he's sitting in his caravan studying. It's about 10 o'clock at night, and all of a sudden, there is a very strong knock on the door. It's a rainy night, the wind is howling, and a very strong knock on the door. Who is it? No answer. Who is it? No answer. He goes to the door, and standing there is Abu Isa. Abu Isa is a relative, is a neighbor of his, does not live too far away. He knows who he is. And Abu Isa is screaming. He's frothing at the mouth. He's literally hysterical. And of course, he's speaking Arabic. My brother's having a very hard time making out what he's saying. Finally, he realized he's saying something about car. I forget the Arabic word for car, but my brother knew that he's saying something about car, and he's saying something, he wants him to go in his car with him. So my brother makes a quick calculation. Go in the car, 3 months into the Intifada, it's 10 o'clock at night, it's pouring rain. Intuition said, he needs help, go. He calls out to his wife, I'm going out with Abu Isa. She says, you're going out with Abu who? But he goes out. They get into the car. As they're driving along, the story begins to unfold. Abu Isa, who has a long history there in Hebron. You know, until 1929, there was a beautiful enclave of Jews in Hebron. 1929, there was a terrible massacre. The yeshiva of Hebron, which was the Slobodki yeshiva, which our yeshiva is related to, the Slobodki yeshiva of Europe, had transferred to Hebron. And many beautiful yeshiva bachrim were massacred that day in 1929. As a matter of fact, I was just reading an account of some American boys who went over to learn there. And some American boys that went over to the Hebron Yeshiva were part of that massacre. I think there were 4 boys from Chicago that were killed in that massacre. It was a horrible day in Jewish history. Well, the Jews came back to Hebron in 1967, 1968, and all the Arabs came running over to them because there's deep history in this city. And the Jews are coming back after the 67 war, and the Arabs are so scared there's going to be a tit for tat. There's going to be a massacre now. Now the Jews have the open hand. The Arabs were so scared. So they all came running out to the Jews, the new settlers, saying, oh, our family, we harbored Jews back in 1929. And indeed, some of them did. And it turns out that Abu Isa was one of these people who came to the settlers in 67, 68, telling him, our family harbored, and they researched it, and his family indeed harbored Jews, saved Jews. And even after that, when some Jews moved back for a very short time in the early 30s, there was a family that lived in his basement. So he had somewhat credentials. Still a scary time, but he had the credentials. So this is Abu Isa. And as they're going along, the story emerges. Abu Isa's daughter was married to his cousin, as the Arabs do. They do a lot of interfamilial marriages. And she was unfaithful. his daughter was unleashed, terrible crime in that world. So he was abusing her. He was beating her. And my brother says he saw her several times after this story. And indeed, she was a very sad sight. So what happened was she ran away. She ran away to her father's house, who lived right next to my brother, or a stone's throw. I shouldn't say a stone's throw when it comes to the Intifada, but just very close to my brother's house. And she had run away. And that was a big crime because she's the property of the husband. She wasn't allowed to do that. So they came, the nephew, Abu Issa's nephew, the husband, came with a gang of his relatives to retrieve her. And indeed, that same night that Abu Issa came to my brother, when my brother came back from Mincha Mariv that evening, he saw a whole bunch of soldiers were at Abu Issa's house trying to sort this all out. He didn't know what it was at the time, but because the enclave of settlers was there was a contingent of soldiers. So the Arabs used the soldiers in order to protect them. So now what does Abu Issa want? He wants my brother to come with him so that he would be able to pick up a son of Abu Issa who's across town, who has a large family, because he was afraid that the next attack from the cousins, from the nephew, would be on the son of Abu Issa. So he didn't want his son to be alone with his family. He wanted to pick him up in 2 cars and bring him back to Abu Issa's house. My brother at that time, he's a settler. He has a gun. He has the authority. He would be able to protect Abu Issa. To make a long story short, they got to the outskirts of the city. In the middle of the trip, they actually got stuck in the mud. They had to get out, knee deep in mud. They had to push the car. It was an ordeal. They pick up the son with his family. They come back. It's midnight. They come back to Abu Issa's house, and Abu Issa says to my brother, "Maybe you'll come in. Let's schmooze. Let's celebrate." It was a beautiful operation. My brother says, this was already crazy that he went with Abu Issa. Now he's going to go into his house. But again, he says intuition told him, go in. So they go in. They start schmoozing. And after a few minutes, my brother says to him, let me ask you, what happened here was unbelievable. The New York Times would never believe what happened here tonight. An Arab from the occupied territories is having trouble with his cousins, with his nephew, with his family. And what does the Arab in trouble do? He goes to the settler. The settlers, that's what they call them, the obstacles to peace. And he asked the settler to put his life in danger in order to help out an Arab. And the settler, without saying anything, just goes and he does it. And here we are. He says, something? Maybe after a night like tonight, you think maybe we can have peace? Abu Issa gets very serious. And he says, oh no, we can never have peace. Because it says in the Quran that even though we accept all the prophets, we accept Moshe as Musa, we accept Yosef as Yusuf, but you did not accept Muhammad. And therefore, you're going to be eternally damned. We will never have peace with you. But then Abu Issa stopped. And here is the point that I'm getting to. He stopped and he said, but I'm a student of history, said Abu Issa. And it's a funny thing, because we believe that you're damned because you didn't accept Muhammad. But you Jews, you had trouble way before Muhammad. Way before Muhammad. So our theology doesn't make sense. These are my words, not his words, we are just another installment in a pattern of history where the Jews are having trouble with people. That's the story. And when I heard that story, I understood Chanukah. I think fully. Let's go back to Bereshis, bara Elokim. Let's go back to the first day of creation. The first 2 questions that we had were about the first day of creation. But instead of looking at the second pasuk first, the second verse, about the darkness that was on the face of the deep. Let's go back to the first pasuk. First pasuk says, the first verse says, Bereshis, in the beginning God created. And if you look at Rashi over there, there's a long, long Rashi, the greatest commentary. Sift through the commentary of Rashi, and you will find there a commentary on the word Bereshis. And it's not for now, the word Bereshis in the beginning, which we translate in the beginning. But it's not for now. But Rashi says, if it really meant to just say the words in the beginning, it should have used a different word. The fact that it says Bereshis is telling you something. The word is to be broken into Bereshis, Beis Reshis. Bereshis is Bishvil Reshis. Bishvil means on account of, due to. Reshis. What's Reshis? Rashi says, take a computer scan of the word Reshis in the Bible. What does Reshis mean in the Bible? What's called Reshis first? Well, one thing that's called first is the Jewish people. The Jewish people are called first. They're called Reshis. So what does it mean, Beis Reshis, Bishvil Reshis? It means on account of Reshis. It means for the sake of the Jewish people. I'm going to get back to this in a minute. Another thing in Tanakh, in the Bible, that's called Reshis is the Torah. The Torah is also called Reshis, first. So Rashi says what the Torah is saying, the Torah is starting out by saying, for the sake of the Jewish people, and for the sake of the Torah, the world was created. Bereshis, Bara Elokim, for the sake of the Jewish people, for the sake of Torah, God created heaven and earth. Slow down, I have a question for you. What percentage of the world are the Jewish people? It's infinitesimal. So what is the rest of the world? Is the rest of the world a mistake in God's laboratory? I mean, how many Chinamen are there? Were they a mistake? And that's why they have squinty eyes? God just was in his laboratory. He was trying to make the Jewish people, and he made Chinamen, he made Japanese, and he made Germans. Was that just a mistake? And of course, the answer is no. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't make mistakes. So what does Rashi mean? And Rashi is quoting our sages. What does it mean for the sake of the Jewish people? So if you look at the writing of the Shloh HaKadosh, and you look at other writings, it becomes clear. It means for the sake of the Jewish people, who are God's ambassadors to mankind, which can bring the message of Torah, Reshis, the Jewish people, the ambassadors, Reshis, the Torah, Bara Elokim. God created the world that there should be ambassadors that are going to teach the world his message. That's you, and that's me, that's the Jewish people. And ultimately, he gave us a Torah to bring to the world, to develop the world, to culture the world. So that's the first pasuk in the Torah. The first pasuk in the Torah gives you and me our marching orders. We are tasked with bringing the message of God to the world. We're supposed to be, as the prophet famously calls us, Or La'amin, a light onto the nations. Where is the greatest manifestation of that role? The Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple. The Holy Temple, the Beis Hamikdash, the Gemara calls Or. The Gemara calls, the temple itself calls light. Why? Ki misham yetze or la'olam. From the Beis Hamikdash, from the temple, that's where light goes into the world. And that's why we all know this. That's why the Beis Hamikdash, the windows of the Beis Hamikdash, were constructed in such a way that light should be going out, to maximize the light go out as opposed to light going in. Because the Beis Hamikdash is or la'amin. Ki mitzion teisei sorah devar Hashem Yerushalayim. The word is supposed to go out from Zion. That's the Beis Hamikdash. This effort is to be led by whom? Who's going to lead the effort of the Or La'amim, of the light onto the nations, of spreading the goodness of God? The leaders of the Jewish people, the holy men of the Jewish people in the Beis Hamikdash. Who are they? The Kohanim, the priests, led, of course, by the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. That's the first pasuk in the Torah. That's the first word in the Torah. B'shvil Yisrael, for the sake of the Jewish people, bringing the message. For the sake of the Torah, which is the message. For the sake of the or of the Beis Hamikdash, which is going to bring the word ultimately to the entire world. That's the first pasuk in the Torah. Now let's go back to the second pasuk in the Torah. V'choshech al panei sahom. There was darkness upon the face of the deep. And our sages say this refers to Malchus Yavan. And we ask the question, the first day of creation? So many years later, Malchus Yavan happened. The kingdom of Yavan happened. But the answer is that the second verse is related to the first verse. Because Klal Yisrael in the first verse, our people were tasked with a role. And the second pasuk says that if you Jewish people, if you forget your role, you forget who you are, might I say, you are nisrashel ba'avoda, you're lax in your service, you lose your way. So then there's going to be a response, what the Torah calls the Greek response, the Greek reaction. Some nation, it doesn't have to be the Greeks, some nation will come along and say that you don't have that status anymore. Listen to these words. You no longer have a portion in the God of Israel. That's the Greek response. That's the Greek reaction. That status was represented by the Ner Ma'aravi, by the Western light. Let's back up for it. It wasn't only the Greeks that said this. Throughout history, people have been saying this. I mean, we live in a day today which is dominated, a world which is Western world dominated by Christianity. The essence of Christianity is to say that the church is the new Israel. You've been cut off from the God of Israel. We are the new Israel. Replacement theology. So I believe in the 1960s, it was muted somewhat, but that's the essence of what the church believes. They're the new Israel. The Muslims, what do they believe? They're not the new Israel. They believe they were always Israel. There's a mistake in our Bible, between Yishmael and Yitzchak. They always were Israel. That's what they say. And would you believe what the Medrash Tanchuma says, my friends? The Medrash Tanchuma says that the great mantra, the mantra of the Greeks was to say, we are the Jews. That's what they always said. So that's what the second pasuk of the Torah is saying. If you lose your way, you lose your enthusiasm, you forget who you are, somebody's going to come along and try to take it away and say, no, okay, it's not you. You lost it. It's going to be us. This special status of Klal Yisrael's mission, of our mission, was represented most saliently, most pointedly with the Ner Ma'aravi, with the light of the candelabra, that Western lamp that never burnt out. The Gemara in Shabbos tells us, what was the idea of that miracle? Was there some message there? The Gemara says yes. The Gemara says, listen to this, Eidus L'boy Olam. It is a testimony to the entire world, Shehashchina Shruya B'Yisrael. It's a testimony to the entire world that the divine presence rests with the Jewish people. At the time of Shimon HaTzadik was a Kohen Gadol at the beginning of the Second Temple era. And listen to this. Very curiously, the Gemara tells us that with the death of Shimon HaTzadik, the miracle of the Ner Ma'aravi stopped. Shimon HaTzadik, the Kohen Gadol, died, and he was called Shimon HaTzadik for a good reason. We have very few people in our history that are entitled HaTzadik. He was a Kohen Gadol par excellence, a leader of the Jewish people par excellence. When he died, says the Gemara, that miracle stopped. They would light the candle in the evening. They would light it in the evening, and the Ner Ma'aravi burnt out when all the other candles burnt out as well. Let's talk about Shimon HaTzadik for a minute. There's another great Gemara about Shimon HaTzadik. The Gemara tells us about an encounter between Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, they call him, and Alexander the Great. So now we could put Shimon HaTzadik in our world history. Shimon HaTzadik lived in a time when Alexander the Great was conquering the world, and conquer the world that man did. And it's always remarkable. You know how old Alexander the Great lived? He lived to 32. 12 years he was the emperor. 12 years he literally conquered the entire known world at the time. An amazing feat. Well, he marched on Yerushalayim, says the Gemara, and the Jews were petrified. Yerushalayim, what he did to all other places that he had conquered. And that was, you come into the land, you destroy, you pillage it, and you kill all the leaders. He didn't want any uprisings. You kill the leadership class, and then you have, they have the proletariat. It's a beautiful method. They were so scared. They were scared of the Beis Hamikdash, and they were scared of their leadership. So what did they do? They got a group of leaders together, a cadre of leaders, to go out to greet him, to give him honor. And who was their leader? Shimon HaTzadik. So before he goes out, he goes back to the Beis Hamikdash. He puts on his vestments, his priestly vestments, and he goes out to greet Alexander the Great with his priestly vestments on. And you can imagine the scene of these two groups, Alexander the Great with his entire army coming to Yerushalayim, and the high priest Shimon HaTzadik coming out to him. And when they get in full view of each other, Alexander the Great falls off his horse and he bows down to Shimon HaTzadik. And the military leaders that are with him, they never saw anything like this in his life. Alexander the Great deferred. He gave honor to no man. This was insane. What was he doing? They pick him up. They say, Alexander, what do you see? He says, that man comes to me in dreams before my big battles. He tells me how to defeat the enemy. Mm-hmm. That's the Gemara. Well, the Gemara doesn't end there. Because do you know people that are named Alexander? My father-in-law, may he rest in peace, was named Alexander. He was named Alexander because of that meeting. Because at that time, Alexander spared the entire Yerushalayim. He spared the Beis Hamikdash. He spared the leadership. And they had an agreement out of honor for Alexander that all the babies born that year, that they were named Alexander. And that's why we have Alexanders. Where does that come from? Alexander is a Jewish name. That's why it's a Jewish name. And besides that, they said that they would give him taxes. And also, out of honor for him, they had a calendar. Calendar for all documents was based on the year of Alexander. So they had three things which they did to honor him. And down to today, we have that we have Jews that are called Sender and Alexander after Alexander the Great. So it's an amazing thing. But what's that all about? What does that mean? Shimon HaTzadik, but he was a military strategist, right? Shimon HaTzadik, the Kohen Gadol, was a military strategist. And he came to Alexander the Great in a dream. What does this mean? Let's just learn a snippet of world history. Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle. Aristotle was a student of Plato, Socrates. He was influenced by the great philosophers. So Alexander the Great was influenced by the great philosophers. The great philosophers were moving away from a pantheon of gods. The great philosophers were moving towards monotheism. The great philosophers, Aristotle, he believed that there was a primary cause. There was something there was a force, there was a higher force. So wherever Alexander the Great, wherever his armies conquered, behind them came these ideas, these enlightened ideas. They spread around the world. And the ideas of Aristotle have remained, I mean, certainly for 2,000 years, up until about 200 years ago, but the philosophies of Aristotle reigned supreme for quite some time. And they were spread by the advancing armies of Alexander the Great. Where did the koach, where did the power for this world change, this change of world philosophy, where did it come from? It came from the Beis HaMikdash. It came from Shimon HaTzadik. Kimitzion Teisei Torah. So it wasn't exactly Torah, but it was a revolution in the thinking of the world. There's a primary cause. That's not too far away from an idea of God as we know him. It revolutionized the thinking of the world. That's what the Gemara means when it says that when he went out to war, he saw Shimon HaTzadik in his dream. It was because of the Beis HaMikdash. It's because Klal Yisrael was operating on all cylinders. It was because the light of God was emanating from the Beis HaMikdash. This allowed Alexander the Great to conquer the world and spread the idea of a one God. Kimitzion Teisei Torah. In some measure, Shimon HaTzadik, through the Beis HaMikdash, the Jewish people were fulfilling their mission of Bereshis, of Bishvil Yisrael. So the Gemara tells us that when Shimon HaTzadik died, everything went downhill. How do we know that? Because that's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says the Ner Ma'aravi miracle, the 400 plus year miracle of that Western lamp stopped. It was done. Again, what did that mean, that Western lamp? It's a testimony that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, rests with Israel. That testimony, that miraculous testimony in the temple was done. Why? Let's go back to the Bach. The Bach explains it. The great Kohen Gadol Shimon HaTzadik died, and the Kohanim lost their direction. They lost their way. Children of Shimon HaTzadik, we know from other Gemaras, were not Shimon HaTzadik.
We are going to be starting dismissal. The Tom's River bus, all the Tom's River bus, please head to your bus exit. Tom's River bus, please head to your bus exit.
So they lost their way, the Kohanim. They were Nisrasho Ba'avoda. How does that happen? How does that happen? How does the high priest, the Kohanim, the spiritual leaders in the spiritual center of the world, how is it that they could be Nisrasho Ba'avoda? How is it that they could be lax, not be enthusiastic? They forget their role. They forget Bereshis bara Elokim. They forget the whole reason of behind creation and their role in creation. They lost it. And therefore it became like a job. And once it became like a job, that's what the Bach is saying. It went downhill from there. There was no enthusiasm. They were lost. They lost their enthusiasm. And over the next 100 years, it went father to son, and the kahuna, the priesthood, it spiritually, it declined to the point where there were no longer Shimons and Yochanans, they had completely Greek names. They turned into Jason. There was Jason after Jason was a Kohen Gadol. The kahuna was bought and sold like a prize. And the kahuna completely deteriorated. But where did it start from? Where did it come from initially? It came from the fact that they were this Rashal Ba'avoda. It came from the fact that they lost their enthusiasm about their role. So this devolved. This went downhill all the way to the point that the Kahuna Gedola, that the priesthood was staffed by imposters, by charlatans, by non-believers. And the Greeks came in, they took over, they influenced, it was done. The great venture of Judaism was done. The Greeks came in and said, Anu Yisrael, we're the new Jew, we're the Jewish people. It was this way for some time. You know, the Beis HaMikdash, I believe it was 3 years. The Beis HaMikdash was standing, wasn't destroyed, but the activity had ground to a halt. I believe it was 3 years. And one day, one family had enough. They were fed up. Who was that family? That was Matisyahu. You remember the story.
Manalapan bus. All students on the Manalapan bus, please head to your bus.
You remember the story. They were in the town of Modi'in. And Matisyahu saw a Jew who was making an offering of a pig. You remember the story, and that sparked the rebellion. My friends, who was Matisyahu? Matisyahu was a Kohen. Matisyahu was a Kohen. So of course, it had to be a Kohen that had to turn things around. So the Bach goes on to say, he says, Nas hanes gamkein, I'm sorry. He says, Ukechazu b'tshuva. When they came back in repentance, liv shar navsho al ha'avoda. When it was the Kohanim who stood up and to give their lives for the service, then Hoshiam Hashem. Hashem saved them. Who did he save them through? Through these Kohanim. That's Yehuda Maccabee, Matisyahu, Yehuda Maccabee, Shimon, Eliezer. These were Kohanim. The family of Kohanim finally had enough, and they said, we are going to reassert ourselves. We're going to take back the spiritual center of the world, the Oro Shel Olam, the light of the world, and we're going to fight for it. We understand our mission once again. And therefore they picked up a sword and they said, kill or be killed.
Lakewood bus. All students on the Lakewood bus, please head to your bus.
They said, kill or be killed. They took up the sword and they fought. They came back into the Beis HaMikdash. And yes, it was miraculous. They found that one flask, that one bottle. And they lit that one bottle. And the beauty of it is that the same miracle that happened years earlier, the miracle that says that the divine presence rests with Israel, the miracle that says that the Jewish people understand their role in the world, that it's our job to bring the goodness of God to the world, that miracle, which gave testimony to the fact that Jewish people understand their role, that miracle came back. People understand that we understand our mission. It didn't come back for 12 hours, came back for 8 days. So we don't celebrate a miracle. We celebrate the return of the miracle. We celebrate the fact that the Jewish people once again understood who they are. And when we light the Chanukah candles, we are making a very major statement. That little candle says, Yesh lanu chelek be'elokei Yisrael. We have a portion in the God of Israel. We have a mission. My friends, The mitzvah to light Chanukah candles is different than every other mitzvah that we have. It's very strange. How many candles are you going to light tomorrow night? 1. Following night, we'll light 2. Why do we do it that way? The Talmud tells us that me'ikar hadin, essentially, each night, all you have to do is light 1. Light 1. And really, each night, you need 1 candle per house. So why is it that, at least in Ashkenazi homes, everybody lights, and
Family, please come to the front. Your couple is here. Please come to the front. Your couple is here.
everyone lights, and everyone lights in ascending order. Why is it that way? The answer is Chazal instituted a mitzvah by which we can show our enthusiasm for the mitzvah. No other mitzvahs like that. Where the mitzvah said, if you want to do it this way, do it this way. If you want to do it this way, do it this way. That's what they said. The Gemara says, if you want to light 1 each night, you want to light 1 on the 7th night, on the 8th night, it's fine. You're yotze the mitzvah. You fulfill the mitzvah. That's okay. You fulfill it. But it's better, it's preferable that each person lights, and it's more preferable that you should go from 1 to 8, that on the 4th night you should light 4. Because this mitzvah is about Klal Yisrael expressing enthusiasm in their role. The reason why at the time of Shimon HaTzadik, after Shimon HaTzadik, things went south is because they lost their enthusiasm. Chanukah is about enthusiasm. And that's why, additionally, there is no mitzvah to eat and drink. I know we all love our sifganiyot, we love our jelly donuts, we love our latkes, but there's really no mitzvah to eat on Chanukah. There's a mitzvah to eat on Purim. What do you mean, a Jew has a holiday without eating? Have you heard such a thing? Jews love to eat. Everything is about food. What's the idea? So again, the Bach, he explains it. He says that Chanukah came about because of a malady of the spirit. There was a problem with the spirit. There was a problem with the excitement about being a Jew and the Jewish role, the mission. And therefore, they wanted to focus on the spirit of the Jew. And therefore, they said the mitzvahs lahodosu lahalel, to give thanks and to give praise. And therefore we say Hallel every day on Chanukah. And therefore, in the davening, in the Shemona Esrei, and in the Birchas Hamazon, we add Al Hanisim, which is to give thanks. Because Jews have to be on fire with excitement about the role that we have in the world. Because when we do, then the light comes from us. The light comes from Yerushalayim. The light comes from the Beis HaMikdash. When it doesn't, the world turns in on us. It folds in on us. That's the celebration of Chanukah. So when we go tomorrow night to Ezras Hashem to light that candle, when we say this statement, Yesh lanu chelek b'elokei Yisrael, we have a portion in the God of Israel. That portion is that we are tasked with spreading, be a paragon of virtue and spreading the mission, the word of God throughout the world. Thank you very much for joining today. I'm sorry for the interruptions, but thanks for holding on. Have a wonderful